The dinner had been set for 20, and Cecily Ashby had been placed at the far end of the table, below the salt, between the estate's elderly land agent and a vicar who had already fallen asleep behind his soup. She did not mind the placement. She had stopped minding such things by the 3rd week of her service at Dryfield Park, when she had understood that minding would cost her more than the slight itself. She was the companion, which was to say she was furniture that occasionally fetched shawls, and furniture did not mind where it was seated. She had learned to fold herself small against the chair back and observe the room from its edges, and she had become, in this way, very good at seeing what the room did not intend to show her. The room tonight was glittering. Lady Beatrice Ashby, Dowager Countess of Dryfield, had lit every candelabra in the dining room for the occasion of Viscount Aldbourne's quarterly visit, and the result was a room that blazed like a jewel box thrown open. Crystal caught and scattered the light. The Dowager herself sat at the head of the table in deep burgundy silk, her diamond earrings moving, when she turned her head, her posture so perfectly maintained that Cecily sometimes suspected she had been born already seated. Miss Louisa Pembridge, the Dowager's niece, sat at the Dowager's right hand in ice-blue satin and pearl drops at her ears. She was very handsome and very aware of it, and she had spent the better part of the fish course arranging her profile toward the chair at the foot of the table that was still as yet empty, the chair that was waiting for Aldbourne. Cecily had been watching the door without appearing to do so, when Lady Beatrice leaned toward her niece and said, quietly enough that Cecily was not intended to hear, but quietly enough that she did, "She keeps looking toward the door, Louisa. Do not concern yourself. She is only the companion. Nobody of consequence." Miss Pembridge laughed, a practiced and musical laugh, and did not look in Cecily's direction at all. Cecily returned her eyes to the land agent's account of a failing drainage ditch, and felt nothing in her face. She was practiced at this, too. The door opened at last. She did not intend to look up. She was committed to the drainage ditch, and she was nearly past the habit of looking up when a door opened. Since doors opened in this house all day long and delivered mostly footmen, the air of the room changed, though the way a room's air changes when a window opens on a cold night. And she looked up. Marcus Holt, Viscount Aldbourne, was standing at the threshold of the dining room in a navy tailcoat, his white cravat precisely tied, the candlelight placing a long shadow at his jaw. He was tall, and held himself with the particular stillness of a man who is never uncertain where he is in a room. He said a brief word of apology to his hostess, took his chair, and allowed the footman to present the soup. He had not looked at Cecily. Then, 2 seconds after he had settled, he looked directly at her. It was not the polite sweeping appraisal of a new arrival checking his surroundings. It was specific. It landed on her face and stayed there for one breath longer than it should have. And then he returned to his soup, and she to her drainage ditch, and neither spoke for the remainder of the first course. She pressed her thumb against the enameled box in her pocket. She carried it, always. Her father had pressed it into her hand 3 days before he died, and she had not yet made sense of the note inside it. "Open the locked drawer," the note said. "3rd nursery. Left side. Ask no one." She had not yet found a locked drawer. The candles burned on. The dining room blazed. At the far end of the table, a long way from anywhere that mattered, Cecily Ashby pressed her thumb against the small oval box and did not look at the door again. Her father, the late Earl of Dryfield, had died in October, and Cecily had arrived at Dryfield Park in November. This was the peculiarity of her situation, which she had accepted as one accepts peculiarities, which is to say without examining them too closely for fear of what the examination might produce. Her father had acknowledged her as his natural daughter, born of a connection he had not spoken of in 20 years, and had left her a legacy of £300 and a formal request, delivered by solicitor, that Lady Beatrice admit her to the household as companion to the Dowager. It was, the solicitor had said, with the careful neutrality of men who carry other people's secrets for a living, the Earl's particular wish. Lady Beatrice had honored it with the cool efficiency of a woman who understood that particular wishes, when left by dead men, were best managed by keeping them close. So Cecily had come to Dryfield. She had her £300 in a bank account she had not yet touched. She had her mended gowns and her books and her pair of white gloves that were beginning to wear thin at the left thumb. She had the enameled box, which was cream and blue and fit neatly in her palm, painted with a small sprig of forget-me-not on the lid. And she had the note which she had read so many times the paper had gone soft at the creases. The house itself had received her with indifference. It was a beautiful house, grey stone Georgian, set in grounds that in another season would have been lovely, and in November were merely melancholy. The elms in the avenue stripped bare, and the walled garden put to frost. She had been given a room on the upper story, small but private, and had spent her first 3 evenings exploring the corridors when the household was asleep. It was on the second of these explorations, climbing toward what the household called the nursery wing, that she had found the door. It was the third door on the left in the upper corridor above the schoolroom, in a part of the house that smelled of old wool and crayon chalk. The nursery itself was partly in use, since Edmund, the new young earl, still slept in the adjoining room with his nurse. The room labeled in old pencil on the doorframe as third nursery was locked, and through the gap at the base of the door came the faint smell of cedar and something older. She had tried the handle 3 times that night and left with nothing. The next morning she had read the note again. Third nursery. Left side, ask no one. She went back to the door and looked at it for a long time. She pressed the enameled box in her pocket. She thought about her father's face in the last days, the particular way he had held her hand and not quite looked at her eyes. She thought about the word illegitimate, which the solicitor had used with the same careful neutrality as all his other words, as though it were merely a category, and not a verdict rendered on her entire existence. She had not yet tried the box's key in the nursery door. She had not yet understood that the key was the thing she was meant to use. She was still, in November, in the process of understanding. The library at Dryfield was on the ground floor, east wing, behind 2 sets of double doors that were kept closed, except on the occasions when the estate's business was in session. Cecily had learned that one of the small privileges of being companion was that she might use the library between the hours of 8 and 10 in the morning, when Lady Beatrice was occupied with correspondence and the room was otherwise empty. She had not expected, on a grey Wednesday, in the 2nd week of December, to find it occupied. Alburn was standing at the long table in the center of the room, with a leather-bound ledger open before him, and a second document beside it that she recognized, even from the doorway, as an estate plan. He did not look up immediately. She had already retreated half a step when he said, without turning, "Miss Ashby." She stopped. "I am not preventing your use of the room," he said, still without turning. "Sit wherever you wish." She chose a chair, near the window, well away from the table, and opened the cowper she had carried down. She did not read. She watched his reflection in the winter glass of the window, the dark tailcoat, the precise movements of his hands as he turned the pages of the ledger. After several minutes, he said, "How long were you acquainted with the late Earl?" She looked up from the cowper. "I was not," she said. "He acknowledged me by letter 6 months before his death. I met him twice. At his invitation, he came to my aunt's house in Bath." She paused. He did not explain himself. Aldbourne turned a page of the ledger without looking at it. He was not, in my experience, a man given to explanation. He turned then, finally, and looked at her across the room. His gray eyes were level and gave nothing away except the fact that they were paying very close attention. "Did he speak to you of the estate?" "No, my lord." "Of the succession?" She felt the enameled box in her pocket, as though it had suddenly become warm. "No," she said. He held her gaze for 1 moment longer than was comfortable, and then looked back at his ledger. "Do not go to the nursery wing alone after dark," he said. "The stairs in that part of the house are uneven, and the lamps are unreliable." He said it mildly. He said it the way a man might say, "Do not stand near the fire in that gown." A practical instruction, a management of risk. She heard it differently. There was something in the specificity of it that was not the general caution of a guardian performing his duties. A man managing risks mentions the whole of the upper floor. A man who knows something says, "Only the nursery wing." She said, "I did not know I had been observed going to the nursery wing." "You have not been," he said. "I am offering a general caution." She returned to the cowper. He returned to his ledger. The room was very quiet, in the particular way of rooms where two people have said less than they meant to, the silence textured rather than empty. She was aware of exactly where he stood in the room without looking at him, aware of the quality of his attention, even when he gave every appearance of attending to nothing but the estate plan before him. Her hand turned a page. She did not absorb a word of it. When she left the library 20 minutes later, she was conscious, in a way she had not been conscious for some months, of the weight of the enameled box in her pocket. The schoolroom was on the upper story, one floor below the nursery wing, and Cecily's duties occasionally brought her to its doorway in the afternoons, when Edmund's nurse needed relief. Edmund himself was a serious, small-boned boy of 8, who had been told he was the Earl of Dryfield, with the same combination of gravity and impracticality that adults typically use when telling children things the children cannot fully understand. He received the information solemnly. He was, Cecily thought, a good child, in the way that children are good when they have not yet been given reason to be otherwise. His tutor, Mr. Crabbe, was not a kind man. Cecily had understood this from the first afternoon she spent in the schoolroom doorway. Mr. Crabbe was the sort of tutor who believed that the quickest path to knowledge was the most humiliating one, and he had installed this philosophy in the schoolroom with the thoroughness of a man who has never once questioned whether it was working. On this particular afternoon, he had set Edmund a Latin exercise, and was now reading aloud the boy's errors in a voice calibrated to carry. "Absurd," Mr. Crabbe said, pointing at the paper. "Embarrassing." "Boz! Do you understand that you're an earl? That men of consequence will expect an earl to know Latin? That you are at present an embarrassment to the title?" Edmund was 8. He sat very still in the way that small children sit, when they have decided that stillness is the safest available option. Cecily walked into the room. "Mr. Crabbe," she said, "I have a message from her ladyship. She requires Edmund in the drawing-room in 20 minutes. This was not true. She had no message. Edmund looked up, and the relief in his face was specific enough to hurt. "Mr. Dinn." Crabbe looked at her with a faint contempt that was his usual expression when addressing anyone below the rank of earls or tutors of earls. "I was not informed of any such requirement." "Her ladyship does not always inform the schoolroom," Cecily said pleasantly. "Edmund, shall I walk you down?" She was aware, when she guided the boy into the corridor and pulled the schoolroom door closed behind them, that there had been a figure at the far end of the passage. She did not look back. She walked Edmund toward the staircase, and the boy held her hand. And that was the end of it. At dinner that evening, Lady Beatrice interrupted the second course to address the table, with a small smile that Cecily had already learned to interpret as a blade being drawn, without hurry. "You must forgive Miss Ashby," she said to no one in particular and therefore to everyone. "She occasionally forgets that she is here as companion, not as guest. We are all very fond of her helpfulness." She paused. "Are we not? Are... It was not a question." The table murmured agreement. Cecily ate her fish. Later, across the table, she was aware that Allborn had not laughed. If you have ever watched a woman who has been told her whole life that she is less than she is, you will understand something about the weight of that dinner. Sit with it for a moment. She has not asked you for your pity. Only your attention. The midpoint of December brought hard frost, and the particular constriction that large country houses achieve when they close themselves against winter. The fires were lit in all the principal rooms. The windows ran with condensation. Edmund's lessons continued in the schoolroom with a new tutor, Mr. Crabbe having submitted his notice with a terseness that surprised no one, and the upper corridor was quiet through the long afternoons. Allborn found her on the day before the winter solstice, in the small sitting room off the library where she took her tea. He stood in the doorway with his hat already in his hand, which meant he was on the point of leaving, and he said, "May I tell you something, Miss Ashby?" He did not wait for permission. He came into the room and set his hat on the table beside her teacup, which was the first object she had ever seen him set down carelessly, and he sat in the chair opposite and looked at the fire for a moment before he spoke. "I had a sister," he said. "Her name was Clara. She was the daughter of my father's first wife, who died when Clara was 4. My father remarried, and his second wife had 3 children by him. And when my father died, it was discovered that his first marriage had been conducted in Scotland under circumstances that a competent solicitor could, and did, argue made it irregular. Clara was 22. She was told she was illegitimate. She was removed from the estate." Cecily set down her teacup. "I fought it for 2 years," he said. "I could not find the documentation to contradict the solicitor's argument. I believed the documentation existed. I could not locate it." He paused. "Clara died of a fever in lodgings in Bristol. She was 26. The fire settled." Neither of them spoke. "Why are you telling me this?" Cecily said at last. He looked at her then directly, with those level gray eyes. "Because I am a man who learns from his failures," he said. "And I am presently involved in reviewing the late Earl's papers, and there are certain things I have found, and certain things I have not yet found. And I am telling you this so that you understand there are situations in the world that resemble each other very closely." He stood, took his hat, and left. He did not say anything else. That evening, Cecily was summoned by Mrs. Gaddis. Pendleton, the housekeeper, a woman of impressive composure who delivered the worst news, with the same expression she used for all news, which was to say, no expression at all. "Her ladyship has determined that your room should be given over to Miss Pembridge," Mrs. Pendleton said. "There is a suitable room in the east wing, on the servants' floor. I will have your things moved in the morning." Cecily heard it. She said, "Thank you, Mrs. Pendleton." She was halfway down the back passage when she heard the housekeeper say to a footman in a voice not quite meant to carry, but carrying nonetheless, "Her ladyship says the companion girl is to use the servants' stairs henceforth. See that she is shown them." Cecily did not stop walking. She turned the corner and stood very still in the cold of the stone passage, and pressed both hands against the wall and breathed. The locked drawer was waiting for her. She had known this for 3 weeks, the way one knows things that cannot yet be acted upon. She went to the nursery wing that night, not in the dark as Aldbourne had cautioned, but in the gray light of 9 in the evening with a candle, and she stood in front of the door to the 3rd nursery and took the enamel box from her pocket. She opened the lid. The note was folded in the bottom as it always was, the paper gone soft at the creases. Beneath the note, secured to the interior of the box's base, by a small loop of ribbon she had never thought to lift, was a key. She had looked at the interior of the box every day for 7 weeks. She had not once thought to look beneath the note. She unlooped the key from the ribbon. It was small and brass and old. She put it in the lock of the 3rd nursery door, and the door opened. The room smelled of cedar and cold air, and the particular staleness of a space that has held its breath for a long time. It held a low rocking horse with the paint worn from the wooden mane, a trunk bound in cracked leather, a window seat with a cushion gone flat from years of disuse. There was a small framed illustration on the wall, a child's drawing of a horse faded to near nothing. On the left-hand wall, beneath the window, there was a low writing desk with 3 drawers. The wood darkened with age. The bottom left drawer had a brass keyhole set into it, the brass green at the edges where no hand had touched it in years. The candle flame wavered in the draught from the door she had left ajar. She stood in the center of the room and breathed, once slowly through her nose. She was not aware of crossing the room. She was simply kneeling before the desk, the candle in one hand and the key in the other. And then the drawer was open. The letters were inside. They were not scattered, as things are when they have been forgotten. They had been arranged, tied with ribbon, ordered by date. She lifted them out with hands that were not entirely steady, and held the candle close. The first was a letter of marriage registration, dated the 14th of April, 1812, recording the lawful union of Reginald Ashby, Earl of Dryfield, and Catherine Mary Wells, at the Church of St. Bartholomew in Nottingham. Registered, witnessed, sealed with the parish mark. The second was a document of birth registration, dated the 3rd of February 1813. A daughter, Cecily Catherine Ashby, born lawfully in wedlock. Named as firstborn child of the Earl of Dryfield and his wife, Catherine Mary Ashby, formerly Wells. She turned the page. She read the name again. She read it a third time. There were 12 documents in the drawer in total. 8 were letters from Fielding's firm in London to the late Earl, written across a period of 14 years, each one a report on the health and circumstances of a young woman currently residing in Bath, under the guardianship of one Miss Harriet Wells. The solicitor's language was formal and careful and completely without warmth. He was reporting on the welfare of an asset that had been set aside, and did not seem to consider there was anything more to say about it. The last 2 documents were in her father's handwriting. One was a letter, addressed to her, never sent. The other was a formal direction to the estate's trustee, signed and witnessed, naming Cecily Catherine Ashby, firstborn child of the first marriage of the Earl of Dryfield, as the legitimate heir to the earldom. Her father had known. He had known for 34 years. He had locked it in a drawer and lived with it, and in the end he had pressed a box into her hands and pointed her toward it, without once looking her in the eyes. She knelt in the dark nursery for a long time. The candle guttered once. She held the documents against her chest, and she did not cry, exactly, but something moved through her that was too large to have a simple name. She brought the letters to Aldbourne at 8 o'clock the following morning. He was in the library when she knocked. He opened the door himself, and she held out the documents without preamble, and she watched him read. She watched his face while he read, and his face was very still. And then there was a moment, somewhere in the 3rd document, when his jaw tightened in a way that she recognized as the suppression of something that could not be allowed through, and she looked away from that. He read everything. He set the letters on the table in the order she had found them. He stood with one hand flat on the topmost document, and said nothing for long enough that she began to understand he was not going to speak first. "What do I do?" she said. "You do nothing yet," he said. "Give me an hour." She had been back in her room for 35 minutes when she heard Lady Beatrice's voice in the corridor below, distinct and carrying even through the floor. She went to the door and opened it a crack. The voices were in the entrance hall below, Lady Beatrice, and a moment later, Aldbourne. She could not hear what he said. He kept his voice level. Lady Beatrice's voice, however, climbed. "Documents can be contested. A solicitor can be found to question any registration. The provenance of such letters, produced at this juncture by a woman of no established standing in this house, will be extremely difficult to substantiate." A pause. "And I trust you are aware of what it will mean for Edmund." Cecily descended the stairs. She did not plan to. Her feet made the decision before she had finished making it, and she was at the foot of the staircase before Lady Beatrice turned and saw her. The dowager's expression arranged itself with the swift efficiency of long practice into something that was not quite welcome. "Miss Ashby," she said, "we were discussing some administrative matters." "I heard some of it," Cecily said. "Then you will understand," Lady Beatrice said, with the cool patience of a woman who has never lost an argument in her own entrance hall, "that this is a complicated situation. That these documents produced now at this particular moment, following your arrival in this household, will appear to any objective observer as an attempt to create a claim where none previously existed." She paused. "Edmund is a child. He is 8 years old. He has done nothing wrong. Whatever your grievances against your father, they are not Edmund's to bear." Cecily looked at her. She thought about the 8-year-old boy sitting very still in the schoolroom. She thought about how good he was, and how it was not his fault, and how that was entirely true, and also not the only truth. She looked at Aldbourne. He was watching her with those level gray eyes, and there was something in his face she had not seen before, something that lived just beneath the gravity and the precision. something that she thought might be called hope if she were the sort of person who used that word easily, which she was not. "I know it is not Edmund's fault," she said. "I have no quarrel with Edmund." She looked back at Lady Beatrice. "But my name is on those documents. My father put it there. Whatever else he failed to do, he did that, and he meant it to be found." Lady Beatrice's expression did not change. Her hand moved slightly toward the fan at her wrist, the way a person's hand moves towards something familiar when they need a moment's steadiness. Cecily turned and walked back up the stairs. She sat in her small servant's room in the east wing for an hour, and then for another, and she did not know what she had done or what would come of it, and the cold of the floor pressed through the thin soles of her shoes. She thought about Edmund sitting at the dining-room table with his solemn expression and his good coat. She thought about the 8 solicitors' letters, each one reporting on the welfare of a young woman in Bath with the detachment of a gamekeeper's census. She thought about her father, pressing the enameled box into her hands and looking somewhere above her shoulder, as though direct sight were a thing he had lost the capacity for. She thought about Lady Beatrice's voice, which had not faltered once, and the way she had invoked Edmund's name with the precision of a woman who knows exactly which argument lands. She was very tired of arguments that landed because the person wielding them had nothing to lose. She had never had nothing to lose. She had always had exactly enough to lose that. Losing. It became a reason to stay still. She pressed the enameled box against her sternum and held it there, and the cold of the east wing gathered in the window glass and in the floor and in the small gap under the door, and she was still there, and she did not move, when the sound of a carriage on the gravel drive came up to her through the window's thin panes. She had not counted on Aldbourne's comprehensiveness. What she did not know, when she carried the documents from the locked drawer to the library that morning, was that Aldbourne had dispatched a rider to Fielding's firm in London 3 days earlier. He had found an irregularity in the estate's succession documents, a reference to a prior registration that had been omitted from the formal summary given at probate, and he had written to the firm without alerting anyone in the household, and without knowing precisely what the rider would find. He had done it because it was the kind of thing a guardian did when something was wrong, and because he was, at his core, a man who did not leave locked drawers locked once he knew they existed. Fielding's clerk arrived at Dryfield Park on the 23rd of December. He arrived during a small gathering that Lady Beatrice had assembled in the drawing-room. 6 neighbors, a clergyman, and Miss Pembridge gathered under the pretense of the reading of certain formal communications from the late Earl's estate that required the presence of a notary. It was, Cecily recognized later, an occasion the Dowager had constructed to establish a public record of the estate's regular functioning under Edmund's name before any challenge could take proper form. The drawing-room at Dryfield was pale-walled, with a marble Adam fireplace, and tall windows facing the walled garden. The notary was seated at the writing desk. Edmund sat beside his mother in a small chair that was slightly too large for him, wearing his good coat and his solemn expression. Aldbourne walked in with the clerk behind him. He walked to the center of the room, and the room noticed him, because rooms always noticed him. And he stood without looking at Lady Beatrice, and addressed the notary directly. "I have asked Mr. Fielding's clerk to attend this reading," he said, "as there are certain documents pertaining to the succession that must be entered into the formal record. This is already in hand," Lady Beatrice said, her voice still perfectly composed. The reading was arranged precisely to address the formal record. "It was," Aldbourne said. He set the letters on the writing desk beside the notary. He did not look at Cecily, who stood at the room's edge near the fireplace, which was her usual position at every gathering. "These documents were discovered in the 3rd nursery of this house," he said. "They constitute the marriage registration of the 1st Countess of Dryfield, the birth registration of the legitimate firstborn of that marriage, and a formal direction from the late Earl to the estate's trustee. Fielding's firm has confirmed their provenance. The provenance of documents produced from a locked room can be questioned," Lady Beatrice said. Her voice was still level, but Cecily, watching her, saw the slight change at the corner of her mouth. as can the motivations of the person who produced them. Oldborn looked at her. He said quietly, and without particular emphasis, "This woman is the rightful heir of Dryfield. I have the letters." 12 words. The room was entirely still. Lady Beatrice did not speak. The notary looked at the documents. The clergyman looked at Oldborn. Miss Pembridge looked at her hands. "Edmund will be provided for," Oldborn said, turning to address the room with the same level calm. "The late Earl's direction provides for him specifically. His education, his establishment, his future will be secured by the estate he was named to. He loses nothing that was properly his to begin with." He paused. What was not his to begin with was the earldom. The fire was burning steadily behind the marble grate. Outside the tall windows the frost still lay on the garden. One of the neighbors, an elderly woman named Mrs. Galbraith, who had known the late Earl for 40 years, said softly, "Good heavens!" Lady Beatrice's fan was in her hand, and her hand was still. Edmund looked across the room at Cecily. He had not fully understood what had happened. He was 8, and he had been told many large things in a small time. And he looked at her with his round brown eyes with the expression of a child who has decided that if she is not frightened, he does not have to be. She gave him a small, steady nod. He returned it, very seriously, with the gap-toothed gravity that was particular to him. She did not look at anyone else for a long time. The weeks that followed were a kind of quiet that she had not known Dryfield could produce. The solicitors came and went. Papers were drawn and signed and sealed. The neighbors absorbed the news with the particular thoroughness with which Regency neighbors absorbed everything, which was completely and publicly, and then moved on to the next subject. Lady Beatrice remained in the house through Christmas, which was not comfortable, but was managed, and departed in January with Edmund and Mrs. Pendleton and the 2 best footmen for a property in Wiltshire that had belonged to her family before her marriage. She did not say farewell to Cecily directly. She sent a note, 4 lines correct in its form and blank of feeling, which was perhaps the only honest thing she had done in the matter. Miss Pembridge had left before Christmas without saying anything to anyone. And Dryfield settled into itself, as houses do when the people who have been wrong about them finally leave. It was Oldborn who found her. On a morning in late January, in the 3rd nursery. She had taken to spending an hour there in the afternoons, and sometimes in the mornings, not because she needed to be there, but because it was the room that had been locked, and she was in the habit of returning to things that had been locked once they were open. Edmund came sometimes. He would sit on the rocking horse, which she had had repainted, and read aloud to her, practicing his vowels. The room smelled now of fresh paint and cold winter light, and the faint sweetness of the honey drops she kept in a dish on the windowsill for him. This morning, he was not there. It was early. The light came in at a low angle through the frost-edged glass, and Cecily sat at the small writing desk with the open drawer before her. She had set nothing in it since the documents were removed. It sat open, empty. The brass key on the desktop beside the enameled box. She heard the step in the corridor, and knew it was not Edmund before the door opened. Oldborn stood in the doorway. He was not wearing his coat. She had not seen him without his coat before. The absence of it did something peculiar to the room. "I disturb you," he said. "You did not," she said. He came in. He looked at the open drawer and at the enameled box on the desk beside her, and then at her. He stood with his hands loose at his sides, which was not his usual posture, and did not speak for long enough that she understood he was not going to do this well, which she found she did not mind. "I should have written," he said finally. "You have written," she said. "You have sent 12 letters in 3 weeks, most of them from your solicitor." "Those were from my solicitor," he said. "Not from me." She looked at him. The morning light was behind him, gray-white and winter soft, and it rendered the faint, vertical line between his brows, the firm straight mouth, the gray eyes that were watching her with the same quality of attention she had first noticed across a candle-lit dinner table in November. She thought about his sister. She thought about a man who had spent 2 years looking for a document he could not find, and had never stopped looking for it afterward. "Sit down," she said. He sat in the small chair beside the window, the one Edmund used. He was too large for it, and did not appear to notice. She set the enameled box between them on the windowsill. "You sent for the solicitor before I found the letters," she said. "3 days before you suspected, without knowing. I suspected because the language in the original succession summary was irregular. A prior registration was referenced, and then not included. It is the kind of thing a person leaves out when they are ashamed of what it shows, and the kind of thing I have learned to look for." He paused. "I was not certain. I wanted to be certain before I said anything to you. Were you afraid I would be hurt if you were wrong?" He was quiet for a moment. "I was afraid," he said, "that you would decide the risk was not worth the fighting. That you had already decided it. You are very good at folding yourself small." The rocking horse stood in the corner with its new paint bright in the low light. The honey drops sat in their dish. Outside the window, the winter garden lay in frost, and beyond the garden wall, the avenue of elms stood stripped and patient, the way trees in winter always look patient, as though they have been through this before and know what comes after it. She reached out and set her hand on the small brass key that lay beside the enameled box. He reached out and set his hand over hers. They stayed like that for a moment. His hand was large and warm, and the touch was so precisely at the edge of what the season permitted that it held all the gravity of everything he had not yet found the words for. She could feel her pulse in her palm. "Clara would have liked this room," he said very quietly. "She was fond of rocking horses." "Edmund is also fond of them," Cecily said. "He tells me the one in the corner was your suggestion. It was a practical purchase." "Yes," she said. "You are very good at practical purchases." Something moved across his mouth that was almost briefly a smile. She had not seen that before either. She thought she might like to see it. Again the winter light held them. The drawer stood open on the desk behind her, empty now, aired out, the cedar smell fading into something lighter. On the first page of the opened register, in the looping copperplate hand of a Nottingham parish clerk from the year 1812, the name Cecily Catherine Ashby had waited 34 years to be read aloud. It had been read. The drawer was open. The key was on the windowsill, and his hand was warm over hers. And outside the frost-edged window the January light was beginning, in its slow British way, to turn. If her journey to this room moved you, leave a thought in the comments below, and we are glad you stayed. Until the end,